Hello, and thanks for joining me. The original title of this video was The Myth of Christian Persecution. I changed it at the last moment to be a little bit more diplomatic, but there is a myth of Christian persecution. It's not the idea that Christians are persecuted today because, unfortunately, Christians are persecuted today, primarily under non-Christian theocracies, including the Kim family worshipping theocracy that is North Korea. Fortunately, there are no militant Christian theocracies at this point in history. The Enlightenment has been successful to that extent at least. But the myth of Christian persecution is the idea that if you're a Christian, then the world is out to get you. Just look at Armando, YouTuber Christ Righteous. He announced in the spring of this year that he would be releasing an album of music in the summer, and the name of the album was They Will Hate Us. It featured a song called Hunt Me Down.
Taking the stone, preaching the gospel, they want me. That it may hunt me down. The devil is trying to stop me. What we can manifest.
The rest of the song has yet to materialize, as does the album itself. The last we heard from Armando, he was going to join the military and go back to school, presumably not at the same time. Although I've never served in the military myself, I am reliably informed by those who have that Armando's "they will hate me, they will hunt me down, the world is out to get me, I am so being persecuted, martyrdom complex," will not be accepted in good humor by, well, his drill sergeant, for starters. But the point is, Armando didn't pick this up in a vacuum. These are learned behaviors. He learned to do this from somewhere. Maybe he learned it from former Vice President Mike Pence, who in 2019 advised the graduating class of Liberty University to prepare to be shunned or ridiculed for defending the teachings of the Bible, which was received with a predictable chant of USA, USA. Maybe he got them from Pence's boss, who took an infamous photo of himself outside of a church, proudly holding a Bible up in the air, upside down, thank you very much, while all around him, off camera, protests for racial justice were going on. The subtext of Christianity being under siege is lost on no one here. Maybe he learned it from people who complained that Christians were being persecuted because places of worship were closed along with everything else during the height of the pandemic, as though we should expect entities a tenth of a micron across to respect ecclesiastical boundaries. Maybe he learned it from the Facebook group In God We Trust, who asked its members to pray for the 229 Christian missionaries who are sentenced to be executed tomorrow by Afghan Islamists. Although Christian persecution does happen in the Middle East, this particular story has no basis in fact. In fact, it's been circulating in some form for over a decade. Maybe he learned them from inmate number 0645217, aka Mr. Kent Hovind, who recently claimed that the government was putting fluorescent material into the vaccines for COVID, which would show up on special cameras in the bodies of people who have received the vaccines so that the government could tell at a glance who has been vaccinated and arrest them. Yeah, he actually said that, and we know that Armando was a fan of Hovind. Maybe he learned them from the organization Open Doors, who every year publishes a list of the 50 most dangerous countries in the world to be a Christian, that is, the countries where Christians are persecuted the most. It defines persecution as any hostility experienced as a result of one's identification with Christ. If you say Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, and the person you're saying it to identifies that as a hostile action because of their Christianity, then according to Open Doors, you are guilty of persecution. Shame on you. To its credit, Open Doors does try to exclude petty things like that when drawing up its list, as a result of which the United States is not in the top 50 countries. Yet. But this list is what the organization is most known for, which means the idea of Christians being persecuted is a core part of their group identity. They're not interested in persecution in general, or even religious persecution in general, but in Christian persecution in particular. And they are teaching other Christians to adopt this identity of being persecuted, including Christians who never see any kind of what they call hostile action beyond, Happy Holidays. Maybe he learned it from Kevin Swanson, the Christian pastor and radio host who complained that laws were being put in place to persecute Christians who don't want to celebrate homosexual heathen rites and rituals, and who also called for gay people to be put to death. See, how it works is, it's only persecution if non-Christians do it. Maybe he learned it from the popular myth of Cassie Bernall, one of the young people killed in the Columbine High School massacre in 1999. The version of the story that I read went that one of the shooters entered, I think it was the school library, and asked the people there if any of them believed in God. Cassie stood up and said, "Yes, I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ." And the shooter said, "You fool," because that's what the non-Christian always says in these stories, "you fool," and executed her. The death of Cassie and all of her classmates is tragic, but the story, according to eyewitness accounts, is false. In fact, one of the shooters found Cassie hiding underneath a table, said peekaboo, and shot her without her saying anything to the shooter. The "Do you believe in God" exchange did take place, but with a different student, one who survived the massacre. That hasn't stopped the "she said yes" story from being spread everywhere in Christian media. And there's certainly been no talk of taking back Michael W. Smith's Dove Award, basically a Christian Grammy Award, for a song inspired by Cassie's so-called martyrdom. Maybe, speaking of Christian music, he learned it from the Christian music group DC Talk, who, with their 1995 album Jesus Freak, started a movement which encouraged young Christians to see themselves as outsiders, as separate from the world and being hunted by it. The lyrics even mention one of their number being beheaded by a king. Fun fact, I actually saw DC Talk in concert in, I think it was 1996, while they were promoting this album. There are two things that I remember vividly from that show. One was one of the singers climbing up onto the lighting fixtures during the final number, scaring the shit out of us. Evidently, Christian music relies pretty heavily on stunts like this. Question: could Neil Peart have done this? Answer: he didn't need to. And the other thing I remember is one of the singers going on a long rant about how atheists wanted to remove "under God" from the Pledge of Allegiance, which led to a predictable round of booing from the predominantly Christian audience. This is the kind of thing they evidently have in mind when they talk of being persecuted. The idea that atheists should be acknowledged as Americans. Here's a life pro tip for you. If the idea of inclusiveness makes you feel excluded, you might want to re-examine your character. Most likely, Armando acquired his persecution complex from a combination of all these influences and others. There's something between an undercurrent and an outright infrastructure in this country dedicated to teaching Christians that they are being persecuted, that any day now, atheists are going to break into their suburban Knoxville, Tennessee living room, complete with black uniforms and dark face-concealing visors, and arrest or outright execute them for the crime of having a Christmas tree or a nativity scene on the front lawn. Which, of course, brings us to... simultaneously, one of the most entertaining and one of the most annoying pieces of fiction ever to come out of the right-wing media complex. It was most heavily talked about in recent years by former Fox News host Bill O'Reilly, who, ironically enough, sold holiday ornaments on his website instead of Christmas ornaments. Go figure. The idea is that cultural forces in the United States want to include people who don't celebrate Christmas, which makes certain people feel excluded, namely those who don't want to be forced to live in an inclusive world. There actually is in history such a thing as a war on Christmas, and it was waged by Christians. It took place in the mid-17th century when the monarchy of England had been overthrown by Oliver Cromwell and his merry men, who instituted a puritanical government which clamped down on the celebration of Christmas. This was partly motivated by a disdain for the extravagance and general merriment that went into Christmas, the so-called 12 days of Christmas. But to the Puritans, it was also an unwelcome vestige of a Roman Catholic tradition. Calls to celebrate Christmas are found in the teachings of the Catholic faith, but not in the Bible itself. So they basically ordered business as usual throughout the realm on Christmas, as well as Easter and other saints' days. This was not by itself enough to end the celebration of Christmas in England. The tradition was much too deeply ingrained for that. But celebrations of Christmas were subdued and sometimes even clandestine until the Restoration in 1660. That was a war on Christmas. What we have today is a bunch of whining, that certain people are forced to live with other people who want to live in peace and harmony with still other people. Much as Christians would like to exist in a calendrical vacuum, the fact is that they had to share the month of December with Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Boxing Day, the winter solstice, Saturnalia, Omisoka, Festivus, and Zamenhof Day, to name a few. Yes, there is such a thing as Zamenhof Day. It's December 15th, and it celebrates the birthday of L.L. Zamenhof, the inventor of the language Esperanto. You might say that Zamenhof Day shouldn't be a holiday, but of course many Esperantists are saying Christmas should not be a holiday. But in Esperanto, so Kristnasko ne estu festo. The core of the persecution complex that pervades all of evangelical Christianity today comes from the tradition that the apostles and the early Christians who came after them were themselves martyrs. That is, they were persecuted and they died for their faith. But the truth is, we have no good reason to think that martyrdom was a big thing in early Christianity. And certainly we have no good evidence that the apostles were martyred. Even apologist Sean McDowell, who is known for being the son of Josh McDowell, but who is even better known for talking to a class full of students at a Christian school while pretending to be an atheist, because, that whole false witnessing thing, it doesn't apply if a good Christian is doing it for good Christian reasons. Anyway, McDowell wrote a whole book on the martyrdom of the apostles, and even he concluded that at most, we can say that Peter, Paul, and the two Jameses were martyred. And from a non-Sean McDowell perspective, even those stories are highly problematic. The written accounts of those alleged martyrdoms were written down decades after the purported events, which means they would have been passed down orally for that amount of time. And in spite of the stories that apologists will tell you about how humans had amazing memories back in the ancient world before computers and so forth, we know that oral traditions do not reliably preserve the original story. We also know that martyrdom stories are very common in the ancient world, not just in the Christian context. People martyr themselves for non-Christian religions, for their nations, for their families, for their virginity, and so on. There's even a story from the Homeric era about a person martyring themselves for wind. Yes, wind. When the fleet of Agamemnon was becalmed, preventing the ships from ever reaching Troy, his daughter Iphigenia sacrificed herself to the goddess Artemis at the hands of her father in order to bring the winds. The legend of this martyrdom was immortalized in a play of Euripides in the 5th century BCE. This is just one example of how, by the time of Jesus, the idea of martyrdom was already part of the public consciousness. Certainly, it would not have been beyond the capabilities of 2nd and 3rd century Christians to invent or highly exaggerate these narratives. After all, they were writing the narratives in order to promote Christianity. None of the accounts of the alleged martyrdom of the apostles can be dated earlier than the 2nd century. The earliest account of the death of Peter, for instance, comes from the Acts of Peter, an apocryphal document, which is dated to the end of the 2nd century, over 100 years after Peter actually died. Moreover, the accounts of the apostles' martyrdom contain fantastic elements, such as talking animals and flying magicians. Clearly, these are not intended as straightforward historical narratives. And let's not forget, there is a difference between persecution and prosecution. The Roman Empire was infamous for executing troublemakers of all kinds. If the apostles were executed for disturbing the peace, then arguably the law in question is unjust, and certainly the punishment is unjust, but there's no reason to think that they would have avoided execution if they had disturbed the peace in the same way on behalf of a non-Christian cause, of which there were many. There's nothing to suggest that they were given the opportunity to save their lives by denying Christ, and if they were given that opportunity, there's nothing to suggest that they didn't take it. In fact, the only reason we know for a fact that the apostles are even dead is that it's been almost 2,000 years and, people don't live that long. We simply don't know how the apostles died. As a side note, without going too much into this issue, there is also a question about whether the historical Jesus, and therefore the followers of the historical Jesus, even existed. One of the earliest and most infamous accounts of persecution in general probably comes from Tacitus, who, in the early 2nd century, described how the Emperor Nero, deflecting blame for the Great Fire of 64, singled out Christians and inflicted great torments upon them. But there is no evidence to corroborate the idea that Christians were well enough known at that time for Nero to take a great interest in them and single them out. In fact, Christians weren't really recognized as a separate and distinct group until toward the end of the 1st century. Even the very word Christian was only just starting to come into vogue when Tacitus wrote his annals. So this account, like many others, is questionable. New Testament scholar Candida Moss argues that from the first 2.5 centuries of the Common Era, we have only 6 accounts of Christian martyrdom which we might consider to be reliable. These include the tales of Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Perpetua, and Felicity. She goes on to argue that even these 6 accounts contain theological ideas which did not exist during the events in question, which means, at the very least, we know that they have been tampered with by later editors. Have Christians been persecuted? Yes. Have they been martyred? Almost certainly. Was this a common enough occurrence at the dawn of Christianity to justify the Christians of today seeing persecution and martyrdom as a core part of the Christian identity? I don't think so. And when the Christian complains of persecution because the cashier at Costco wishes them happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, or because in the normal course of their day job they are expected not to discriminate against same-sex couples or non-Christian quote-unquote lifestyles, or because they're being criticized on YouTube, then they should be gently reminded of what happened in Alexandria, Egypt on New Year's Day 2011. Just after midnight, an explosive device was set off in front of the Saints' Church, a Coptic Orthodox church, while inside the church, several thousand Christians were attending midnight mass. 23 were killed, and nearly 100 injured. The responsible party was never caught, but the attack has been reported to be the work of an Islamist terrorist group based in Gaza. This is not a case of martyrdom. The 23 people who died did not expect to die. They expected to, go to church and then go home. In fact, one of the victims, just a few minutes before the event, posted on Facebook about how much she was looking forward to the new year. But it is a case of Christian persecution. Again, the myth of Christian persecution isn't the idea that it happens. It does happen, and the Saints' Church in Alexandria is what it looks like. So to the Christians watching this, it's high time that you put things into perspective. You are not entitled to say you are persecuted because there's a holiday tree instead of a Christmas tree in front of City Hall. You're not entitled to say you're persecuted because your boss expects you to do the job you signed up for. You're not entitled to say you're persecuted because you live in one nation indivisible. And you're certainly not entitled to say you're persecuted because there are gay people in this country who have not been executed. Muddying the waters in this way makes it very difficult to study the actual causes of actual religious persecution. And speaking as someone who might well be persecuted for being an atheist if, and I hope this is a very big if, certain people in this country get their way, I would like to see a lot of thorough and very public study done on the topic. What causes persecution, real persecution, of Christians, of Muslims, of Buddhists, of atheists? And most important, how do we prevent it from happening? I don't really know the solution to that, but I do know this. It doesn't involve talking like this.
Taking the storm, preaching the gospel, they want me, that it may hunt me down. Devil is trying
If you
to
enjoyed
stop
this
me.
video and want to help my channel grow, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Be sure to hit the bell to be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to share your thoughts on Christian persecution or your preferred holiday greeting, leave a comment below. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. You help make this channel possible. If you'd like to become a supporter, check out the link in the description. Thanks as always for joining me, and we'll see you in the next video. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.